The dust kicked up around her worn boots as Sarah Bennett shifted beneath the wooden slats of the general store porch, trying to find a position that didn't press splinters into her back through the thin fabric of her dress. She had been sleeping there for 3 nights now, ever since the stagecoach had deposited her in Concordia, Missouri, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the bitter taste of broken promises in her mouth. Her brother had written that he would meet her here, that he had established a homestead and needed family to help work the land. But when she arrived, dusty and travel-worn, the postmaster had delivered news that froze her blood. Her brother had died 2 months prior in a farming accident, and his land had already been claimed by creditors. Now she lay beneath the general store, invisible to the townspeople who walked above her, listening to the conversations of shoppers and the rhythmic creaking of floorboards that served as her only company in this harsh frontier town in the summer of 1876. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink when she heard footsteps approaching the store, different from the usual hurried pace of merchants and customers. These steps were measured, deliberate, accompanied by the soft jingle of spurs. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself further into the shadows beneath the porch, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing her makeshift shelter. But the footsteps stopped directly above where she lay, and then she heard the creak of leather as someone crouched down. "Miss, I can see you under there," a man's voice said, gentle but tinged with concern. "Are you hurt?" Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She had managed to avoid detection for days, sneaking out before dawn to wash her face at the public pump and returning after dark when the streets emptied. Now, caught in the growing daylight, she had nowhere to hide and no acceptable explanation for why a woman would be sleeping beneath a porch like a stray dog. "I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Please just go about your business." The man didn't move. "It's going to be another hot day. Can't be comfortable under there, and it isn't safe. Why don't you come out and we can talk proper?" Sarah closed her eyes, feeling tears prick at the corners. She had been so careful, so determined to remain unseen until she could figure out what to do next. The thought of emerging into the harsh light of scrutiny, of having to explain her circumstances to a stranger, filled her with shame so acute it felt like a physical pain in her chest. "I don't need charity," she said, hating how her voice trembled. "Didn't offer any," the man replied. "Just offered conversation. There's a difference." Something in his tone, a kindness that seemed genuine rather than patronizing, made Sarah reconsider. She couldn't stay under this porch forever, and she was hungry enough that her stomach had stopped growling and started aching with a dull, persistent pain. Slowly, she began to crawl toward the opening, blinking as the morning light hit her eyes. The man who had discovered her was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard labor and sun-weathered skin that testified to years spent outdoors. His dark hair curled slightly at the collar of his work shirt, and his eyes, a startling shade of hazel that seemed to shift between green and gold, regarded her with concern rather than judgment. He appeared to be in his late 20s, and there was something steady about him, something that reminded Sarah of the oak trees back in Pennsylvania that had weathered countless storms without breaking. "Name's Hayes Northwood," he said, offering his hand to help her to her feet. "I run a small ranch about 5 miles outside town." Sarah accepted his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm that marked him as a working man. As she stood, she became acutely aware of how she must look. Her dark blonde hair tangled and unwashed, her dress wrinkled and stained with dust, her face probably smudged with dirt. She was 22 years old, but in that moment she felt ancient and utterly defeated. "Sarah Bennett," she managed, releasing his hand quickly and wrapping her arms around herself defensively. Hayes didn't comment on her appearance, which somehow made her feel both grateful and more embarrassed. Instead, he glanced toward the general store, which wouldn't open for another hour, then back at her. "Have you eaten recently?" The question was simple, but it broke something in Sarah. She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "The boarding house serves breakfast starting in about 15 minutes, Hayes said. "Why don't we head over there? You can tell me your story or not, whichever suits you, but at least you'll have a hot meal in your belly." Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to cling to the shreds of her pride, but the smell of bacon drifting from the boarding house kitchen made her stomach clench painfully. She nodded, following Hayes down the dusty main street of Concordia as the town began to wake around them. The boarding house dining room was empty except for a few ranch hands finishing their coffee. Hayes led her to a table near the window and spoke quietly to the woman who ran the establishment, pressing coins into her hand. Soon, Sarah found herself staring at a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, biscuits, and fried potatoes. She forced herself to eat slowly, to maintain some semblance of dignity, even though every fiber of her being wanted to devour the food like a starving animal. Hayes ate his own breakfast in silence, giving her space, and Sarah found herself studying him between bites. He had a strong profile, with a straight nose and a jaw that suggested stubbornness. But his eyes were kind, and there was a sadness around them that spoke of his own disappointments and losses. He wore his gun belt low on his hip, the way men did who actually knew how to use the weapon, but there was nothing threatening in his manner. When she had finished eating, Sarah set down her fork and took a long drink of water, then finally met Hayes's gaze directly. "Thank you," she said. "I haven't eaten properly in days." "You want to tell me what brought you to sleeping under the general store porch?" Hayes asked. "Or would you rather I didn't pry?" Something about him made Sarah want to talk, to unburden herself to this stranger who had shown her more kindness in an hour than she had received in months. So she told him everything. About her brother's letter, the long journey from Pennsylvania, the devastating news of his death, and the complete absence of any other family or resources that had left her stranded in Concordia with no money, no prospects, and nowhere to go. "I've been looking for work," she said, her hands twisting the napkin in her lap. "But no one in town wants to hire a woman with no references, no skills beyond basic housekeeping. The boarding house is full, and even if it wasn't, I couldn't afford a room. I've been sleeping under that porch and trying to figure out what to do next. I thought maybe I could earn enough money somehow to buy passage on a stagecoach, but I don't even know where I would go." Hayes listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the growing activity on the street. "I have a proposition for you," he said finally. "And I want you to hear me out before you decide I'm some kind of scoundrel with improper intentions." Sarah tensed, her earlier trust wavering. She had heard about propositions from men, about the kinds of work desperate women sometimes turned to in frontier towns where survival often meant compromising one's morals. Hayes must have seen the fear in her eyes because he quickly continued. "I have a spare room at my ranch. It was meant to be a guest room, but I never have guests, so it just sits empty. The ranch house is small but sturdy, and the room has a door with a lock on the inside, so you'd have complete privacy. I'm proposing you take that room, no payment required, while you figure out your next steps." "I don't understand," Sarah said carefully. "What would you want in return?" "Nothing improper, I promise you that," Hayes said firmly. "But if you were willing, I could use help around the ranch. I'm trying to run the place on my own, and it's more than one person can reasonably manage. The house needs cleaning, meals need cooking, The vegetable garden needs tending. If you were willing to help with those things, it would be worth the room and board to me. You'd have time to rest, to recover, to figure out what you want to do. And if you decided to move on, I'd pay you fair wages for your work, enough to buy passage wherever you wanted to go. Sarah searched his face for signs of deception or hidden motives, but Hayes met her gaze steadily. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked. Hayes was quiet for a moment, then said, "I know what it's like to have nowhere to turn. When I first came out here 4 years ago, I was in a similar situation. A rancher named Tom Crawford gave me work when I was down to my last dollar, taught me everything I know about running a ranch. He died 2 years ago and left me his land. Said I reminded him of himself when he was young, and he wanted to see someone get the kind of second chance he got. I guess I figure if Tom could help me when I needed it most, I can do the same for someone else." The sincerity in his voice made Sarah's eyes sting with tears again. She blinked them back, trying to maintain her composure. What if people talk? A single woman living at your ranch without a chaperone, it would cause a scandal. "Let them talk," Hayes said with a shrug. "I don't pay much mind to gossip, and most folks around here know I'm not the type to take advantage. But if it concerns you, my nearest neighbor is a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who lives about a mile down the road. She's a respectable woman who could vouch for your character if needed. And if you wanted, I could introduce you to her. Let her know the arrangement so there's no question about it being above board." Sarah considered the offer, weighing her limited options. She could refuse, cling to her pride, and continue sleeping under the general store porch until either starvation or the elements claimed her. She could try to find work in town again, though days of searching had yielded nothing but suspicious looks and closed doors. Or she could take a chance on this stranger, who had shown her more compassion in an hour than most people had shown in a lifetime. "If I agreed," she said slowly, "it would be a business arrangement. I would work for my room and board, and when I had earned enough to leave, I would go with no hard feelings on either side." "That seems fair," Hayes agreed. "And you promise, on your honor, that you expect nothing improper from me?" Hayes placed his hand over his heart. "On my honor as a man and before God, I promise. The room is yours with a lock on the door. You're safe under my roof, Miss Bennett." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, about to leap into unknown waters. But what choice did she have? "All right," she said. "I accept your offer." The ride out to Hayes's ranch took them through rolling Missouri countryside, green and lush in the summer heat. Sarah sat beside him on the wagon bench, trying not to think about how close his shoulder was to hers as the wagon bounced over the rutted road. They passed several other homesteads, and Hayes pointed out landmarks and explained the layout of the area. "That's the Patterson place," he said, gesturing to a neat farmhouse with a white picket fence. "Mrs. Patterson keeps chickens and sells eggs in town. Her husband died in the war, and she's been running the place on her own ever since. Tough as nails, but with a good heart." As if summoned by the mention of her name, an older woman emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the sun. Hayes pulled the wagon to a stop, and the woman approached, her keen gaze taking in Sarah with frank curiosity. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson," Hayes said. "I'd like to introduce you to Miss Sarah Bennett. She's going to be staying at my place for a while, helping with the housework and such." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained neutral. "Is that so?" She turned to Sarah. "Where are you from, Miss Bennett?" "Pennsylvania, madam," Sarah said, straightening her spine and meeting the woman's gaze directly. "I came here to join my brother, but he passed before I arrived. Mr. Northwood has kindly offered me employment and lodging while I determine my next steps." The older woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Hayes is a good man," she said. "One of the few around here worth trusting. You'll be safe with him." She turned back to Hayes. "But you make sure people know the arrangement is proper, you hear? A young woman's reputation is fragile as glass out here." "Yes, madam," Hayes said with a slight smile. "I was hoping you might help with that, actually. Maybe stop by for tea sometime soon, so folks can see there's nothing improper going on." "I'll do that," Mrs. Patterson said. She reached up and patted Sarah's hand where it rested on the wagon seat. "You need anything, girl, you come see me. I'm just down the road." The gesture of kindness coming from this practical stranger made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, madam," she managed. As they continued toward the ranch, Sarah found herself relaxing slightly. The presence of a respectable neighbor who seemed willing to vouch for the arrangement eased some of her concerns about the impropriety of the situation. Hayes's ranch came into view as they crested a small hill. The house was indeed small, a simple wooden structure with a covered porch and a stone chimney. But it looked well maintained, with fresh paint on the shutters and a neat vegetable garden beside the house. Behind the house stood a barn, a chicken coop, and several corrals where a handful of horses grazed peacefully. "It's not much," Hayes said, and Sarah could hear a note of pride in his voice despite the modest words. "But it's mine and it's home." "It's lovely," Sarah said and meant it. After nights spent sleeping under a porch, the little ranch house looked like a palace. Hayes helped her down from the wagon, and Sarah noticed again how careful he was not to hold her hand any longer than necessary, how he maintained a respectful distance. He led her up the porch steps and opened the front door, gesturing for her to enter. The interior of the house was simple but clean. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a rough-hewn table in the center. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with supplies and a few books. 2 doors led off from the main room, both closed. "That's my room," Hayes said, pointing to one door, "and this is yours." He opened the other door, revealing a small room with a single bed covered in a faded quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window that looked out over the prairie. It was sparse, but to Sarah, it looked like heaven. "There's a lock on the inside of the door, like I promised," Hayes said, demonstrating the simple bolt lock. "And there's a wash basin and pitcher on the dresser. I'll heat some water so you can wash up if you'd like." Sarah stepped into the room, running her hand over the quilt. It was clean and smelled faintly of soap and sunshine. "It's perfect," she said quietly. Hayes smiled, and the expression transformed his face, making him look younger and less careworn. "I'll let you settle in. There's a trunk at the foot of the bed that's empty if you need storage, though I suppose you don't have much to store right now." The reminder of her destitute situation stung, but Hayes didn't seem to mean it cruelly. It was simply a statement of fact. "I'll heat that water and bring it to you," he continued. "Then I need to tend to the horses and check on the cattle. Take your time getting situated. We can talk about the work arrangements later." After he left, closing the door quietly behind him, Sarah sat on the bed and let out a long, shaky breath. The mattress was thin but infinitely better than the hard ground beneath the general store porch. She lay back, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a small flicker of hope kindle in her chest. True to his word, Hayes brought her a basin of warm water, setting it outside the door and knocking to let her know it was there. Sarah stripped off her filthy dress and washed herself thoroughly, scrubbing away days of dirt and despair. She had no other clothes to change into, so she did her best to clean her dress, wringing it out and hanging it over the back of the chair to dry. Wrapped in the quilt from the bed, she sat at the window and watched Hayes working in the corral, training a young horse. He moved with confidence and patience, speaking to the animal in low tones she couldn't quite hear. There was something mesmerizing about watching him work, something that made her feel both restless and calm at the same time. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the prairie, Hayes returned to the house. He knocked on her door, and Sarah, having put her dress back on despite its dampness, opened it cautiously. "I was thinking I'd make some supper," Hayes said, "but I should warn you, my cooking skills are pretty basic. Usually just beans and bacon or whatever I can manage without setting the place on fire." "I can cook," Sarah said. "If you'll show me where everything is, I'd be happy to make supper. It's the least I can do." Hayes looked relieved. "That would be mighty appreciated." They worked together in the small kitchen, Sarah taking stock of his supplies while Hayes built up the fire in the stove. She found flour, dried beans, some salt pork, and a few vegetables from the garden that were past their prime but still usable. It wasn't much to work with, but she had learned to make do with less during the lean years after her parents died. As she cooked, Hayes set the table and made conversation, telling her about the ranch, his daily routines, and the challenges of running a place this size alone. Sarah found herself relaxing in his presence, appreciating that he didn't press her with questions or make her feel like a curiosity to be studied. "Tom, the man who left me this place, always said the key to good ranching was paying attention to the small things," Hayes said, leaning against the counter and watching her work. "A fence that needs mending, a horse that's favoring one leg, changes in the weather. You take care of the small things and the big things tend to sort themselves out." "Sounds like wise advice," Sarah said, stirring the pot of beans she had set to simmering. "He was a wise man," Hayes said, a note of sadness in his voice. "Losing him was hard. He was like a father to me, more than my actual father ever was." Sarah heard the pain in his words and recognized it as similar to her own. "What happened to your real father?" she asked, then quickly added, "I'm sorry, that's too personal. You don't have to answer." "It's all right," Hayes said. "Fair question, considering you told me your story this morning. My father was a gambler and a drunk. He lost everything we had, including our farm, in a poker game when I was 19. My mother had already died of fever the year before. I had nothing and no prospects, so I headed west, figuring I couldn't do worse out here than I had back in Ohio. That's when I met Tom. He saw something in me worth saving, I guess." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "About your parents, I mean, and about losing Tom." Hayes shrugged, but she could see the emotion in his eyes. "Life out here is hard. You lose people, but you also find new family if you're lucky. Tom used to say that family isn't just blood, it's the people who show up when you need them most." They ate supper together as the last light faded from the sky, and Sarah marveled at how comfortable she felt in this stranger's home. Hayes was easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor that occasionally surprised a laugh from her. He asked about her life in Pennsylvania, and she found herself telling him about her parents' small farm, how her father had died when a horse kicked him in the chest, how her mother had followed him less than a year later, worn down by grief and hard work. "My brother Jacob was 10 years older than me," she said. "He took care of me after our parents died, but it was hard on him. When he decided to come west and try his luck at homesteading, I stayed behind with our aunt. She was kind enough, but she made it clear I was a burden. When Jacob wrote and said he had land and wanted me to come help him work it, I was so happy. I thought finally I'd have a real home again, a place where I belonged. And instead you found he was gone," Hayes said quietly. Sarah nodded, blinking back tears. "I don't understand why these things happen. Why good people like Jacob and your Tom have to die while others who don't care about anything or anyone seem to live forever? If I knew the answer to that, I'd be a wiser man than I am, Hayes said. All I know is that we have to keep going, keep trying to build something good, even when it feels like everything's falling apart. After supper, Sarah insisted on washing the dishes while Hayes went out to check on the animals one last time before bed. When he returned, he showed her where he kept the lamp oil, explained the morning routine, and bid her a polite good night. Sarah lay in her small bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie. The distant howl of coyotes, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the creak of the house settling. Despite the strangeness of her situation, she felt safer than she had in months. She sent up a silent prayer of thanks for Hayes Northwood and his unexpected kindness, then drifted off to sleep. The next weeks settled into a routine that surprised Sarah with its comfort. She woke early each morning, well before dawn, and started the fire in the stove. By the time Hayes came in from his first check on the animals, she had coffee brewing and breakfast cooking. They ate together, making quiet conversation as the sun rose. Then Hayes would head out to work the ranch while Sarah tackled the housework. The house had been kept clean enough, but it lacked the touches that made a place a home. Sarah found herself scrubbing floors, washing curtains, organizing shelves, and tending the neglected vegetable garden with a vigor that surprised her. It felt good to work, to be useful, to fall into bed at night physically exhausted but mentally at peace. Hayes was unfailingly respectful, always knocking before entering a room she was in, maintaining a proper distance and treating her with a courtesy that made her feel valued rather than pitied. He brought in fresh vegetables from the garden, game he had hunted, and occasionally a treat from town like real sugar or coffee beans. In return, Sarah cooked meals that made him close his eyes in appreciation, mended his clothes, and slowly transformed the bachelor's house into a home. Mrs. Patterson visited 3 times in the first 2 weeks, ostensibly to check on Sarah, but clearly also to reassure herself that Hayes was behaving honorably. She seemed satisfied with what she found, and began spreading the word in town that the arrangement was entirely proper. Sarah was grateful for the older woman's support and found herself looking forward to her visits. One evening, about a month after Sarah had arrived, Hayes came in from the barn looking troubled. Sarah was at the stove making stew, and she turned to look at him with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked. Hayes hung his hat on the peg by the door and ran his hand through his hair. "There's trouble brewing with the Jameson brothers," he said. "They've been causing problems for several of the smaller ranchers in the area, trying to pressure us to sell our land. They want to build up a bigger operation, and they're not particular about how they go about it." Sarah had heard about the Jameson brothers in town. They ran the largest ranch in the area and had a reputation for ruthlessness. "What kind of problems?" she asked. "Fences cut, cattle spooked, supplies going missing. Nothing you can prove was them, but everyone knows. Old man Simmons down south of here sold out last month after his barn mysteriously burned down. The Jamesons bought his land for a fraction of what it was worth." "That's terrible," Sarah said, her hand tightening on the wooden spoon. "Can't the sheriff do anything?" Hayes laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sheriff Mason is in the Jamesons' pocket. Everyone knows it, but no one can prove it. Out here, might often makes right, and the Jamesons have plenty of might." "What will you do?" Sarah asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. In the month she had been here, the ranch had begun to feel like home. The thought of something happening to it or to Hayes made her chest tighten with fear. "I'll do what Tom taught me," Hayes said. "Stay vigilant, Take care of the small things and don't give them any excuse to come after me directly. And I'll stick with the other small ranchers. There's strength in numbers, even if we're not as powerful as the Jamesons." That night, Sarah found it hard to sleep. She lay in her bed, listening to the night sounds and imagining every creak was someone approaching the house with ill intent. When she finally did drift off, her dreams were troubled, filled with flames and shadowy figures. The next morning, she was up even earlier than usual, startled awake by a sound she couldn't identify. She threw on her dress and hurried out of her room, finding Hayes already up and pulling on his boots. "What is it?" she asked. "Thought I heard something by the barn," he said, strapping on his gun belt. "Probably just a coyote, but I need to check. You stay inside and bolt the door behind me." Sarah's heart pounded as she watched him slip out into the pre-dawn darkness. She stood by the window, straining to see anything in the gloom, her hands clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. Minutes passed like hours until finally she saw Hayes's figure emerging from the barn, lantern in hand. When he came back inside, his expression was grim. "Someone cut the fence on the north pasture," he said. "Looks recent. They were probably hoping the cattle would wander off, but I found it in time." "Was it the Jamesons?" Sarah asked. "Can't prove it, but I'd bet money on it," Hayes said. He looked exhausted and worried, and Sarah felt a surge of protective anger on his behalf. "What can I do to help?" she asked. Hayes looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You being here helps more than you know," he said quietly. "Coming home to a clean house and a hot meal, having someone to talk to at the end of the day, it makes everything else easier to bear." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Over the past month, her feelings toward Hayes had grown more complicated. She respected him, was grateful to him, but increasingly she found herself noticing other things. The way his hair curled when it got too long, the strength in his hands as he worked, the kindness in his eyes when he looked at her. She tried to push these thoughts aside, reminding herself that she was here as an employee, that she had no claim on him beyond their business arrangement, but it was becoming harder to maintain that distance in her heart. "I'm glad I can help," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "I owe you a great deal." "You don't owe me anything," Hayes said firmly. "You work hard, you've earned your place here. If anything, I should be thanking you for taking a chance on a stranger's offer." They stood there in the kitchen, the lantern light casting shadows on the walls, and Sarah felt the air between them change, become charged with something unspoken. Hayes seemed to feel it too because he cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should go fix that fence before the cattle do wander off," he said. "I'll have breakfast ready when you're done," Sarah replied. As the summer progressed, the tension both on the ranch and between Sarah and Hayes continued to build. There were more incidents. Supplies that went missing, strange noises in the night that turned out to be nothing, and constant rumors in town about other ranchers being pressured by the Jamesons. Hayes spent long days working the ranch and longer nights keeping watch, and Sarah could see the strain wearing on him. She found herself worrying about him constantly, watching from the window as he worked in the corrals, listening for his footsteps at night to make sure he was safely inside. Her feelings for him had grown beyond respect and gratitude into something deeper, something that made her heart race when he smiled at her and ache when she saw him troubled. But she kept these feelings locked away, certain they were inappropriate and unwelcome. Hayes had offered her shelter out of kindness, not because he had any romantic interest in her. She was a stray he had taken in, nothing more. To presume otherwise would be to betray his trust and jeopardize the only stable situation she had. One particularly hot afternoon in August, Sarah was in the vegetable garden, pulling weeds and trying not to think about how much she had come to care for the man who owned this land. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the horse approaching until it was nearly upon her. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw two men on horseback watching her from the edge of the property. They were both large men, dressed in expensive clothes that seemed out of place on a working ranch. The one on the left had a scar running down his cheek, and his eyes were cold as they surveyed her. These had to be the Jameson brothers Hayes had warned her about. "Afternoon, miss," the scarred man said, tipping his hat but making the gesture seem mocking rather than respectful. "You must be the woman staying with Hayes Northwood." Sarah stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands and trying to calm her racing heart. "I work for Mr. Northwood," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" "Where's Northwood?" the other man asked. He was slightly younger, with a cruel twist to his mouth that made Sarah's skin crawl. "He's out checking the cattle," Sarah said. "If you'd like to leave a message, I can pass it along." The scarred man laughed. "No message needed. We just wanted to get a look at the place, maybe make him an offer. This is good land, wasted on a one-man operation. Northwood would do better to sell to us, move on to something more suited to his abilities." "Mr. Northwood isn't interested in selling," Sarah said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." "That's a shame," the younger man said. "Things have a way of getting difficult for people who don't know when to take a good offer." The threat was barely veiled, and Sarah felt anger surge through her fear. "I think you should leave," she said. "Now." The two men exchanged glances, then the scarred one smiled, showing too many teeth. "Spirited thing, aren't you? Well, you tell Northwood we stopped by. Tell him the offer still stands, but it won't stand forever." They rode off, kicking up dust, and Sarah stood there trembling with a combination of fear and fury. When Hayes returned an hour later, she told him about the encounter, watching his jaw tighten with each word. "They came onto my property," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They threatened you." "They didn't threaten me directly," Sarah said, "but the implication was clear. Hayes, I'm worried. These men are dangerous." Hayes paced the kitchen, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "I should have been here," he said. "If something had happened to you because of me, because of this land dispute, I could never forgive myself." "Nothing happened," Sarah said, "and you can't be everywhere at once. But maybe we should think about getting help, talking to the other ranchers, forming some kind of organized response." Hayes stopped pacing and looked at her, and Sarah was struck by the intensity in his eyes. "We," he said softly. "You're thinking of this as your fight too." Sarah realized what she had said, how she had unconsciously claimed a stake in the ranch's future. She could have backtracked, maintained the professional distance she had been trying to preserve, but looking at Hayes, she couldn't bring herself to lie. "Yes," she said simply. "This place has become important to me. You've become important to me." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Hayes took a step toward her, then seemed to catch himself. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I need to be honest with you about why I offered you that room, why I've been so careful to keep my distance." Sarah's heart pounded. "All right," she said. Hayes took a deep breath. "When I first saw you under that porch, my first thought wasn't pity or charity. It was that you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, even covered in dust and looking like you'd been through hell. That thought scared me because I didn't want to be the kind of man who takes advantage of someone in a desperate situation. So I made myself that offer to help, and I meant every word of it, but my motivations weren't entirely selfless." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture Sarah had come to recognize as a sign of his agitation. "These past months, having you here, it's been both wonderful and torturous. Every day I have to remind myself that you're here because you needed help, not because you chose to be with me. I've tried so hard to be respectful, to give you space to figure out what you want, but Sarah, I need you to know that I've fallen in love with you." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "You love me," she whispered. "I do," Hayes said. "I love the way you hum while you cook, the way you talk to the chickens like they're people, the way you've made this house feel like a home. I love your strength and your stubbornness and your kindness. I love you, and I understand if you don't feel the same way. I understand if you want to keep things as they are or if you want to leave. But with the Jamesons threatening trouble, with everything that's happening, I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." Sarah crossed the space between them in 3 quick steps and took his hands in hers. "I love you too," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I've been trying not to because I thought you only saw me as someone you were helping, but Hayes, I've fallen completely in love with you." The smile that broke across Hayes's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He cupped her face gently in his calloused hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Please," Sarah breathed when their lips met. It was like coming home. Hayes kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. Sarah wound her arms around his neck, pressing herself against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the rapid beating of his heart that matched her own. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for so long," he murmured. "I wish you had done it sooner," Sarah said with a shaky laugh. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, and Sarah felt a happiness so profound it almost frightened her. After months of desperation and despair, after losing her brother and finding herself alone in a strange town, she had somehow found love in the most unexpected place. But their moment of peace was short-lived. The troubles with the Jamesons continued to escalate. A week after Hayes and Sarah had confessed their feelings, Hayes rode out to check on the cattle and returned with 2 of his best cows missing. The next week, someone poisoned the well, forcing Hayes to spend precious time and money digging a new one. Then Mrs. Patterson's barn was set on fire, and although she survived, she lost most of her livestock and feed stores. Hayes called a meeting of all the small ranchers in the area, gathering them in the schoolhouse in Concordia. Sarah attended with him, standing at his side as he addressed the worried crowd. "We all know who's behind this," Hayes said. "The Jamesons want our land, and they're willing to use intimidation and violence to get it. If we don't stand together, they'll pick us off one by one until they own everything." "What do you propose we do?" asked an older rancher named Amos Henderson. "We can't fight them head-on. They've got more men and more money." "We don't need to fight them head-on," Hayes said, "but we can watch out for each other. If we take turns keeping watch on each other's properties, if we document every incident and send reports to the territorial governor, if we make it clear we're not going anywhere, eventually they'll have to back off or risk bringing down real law enforcement from outside the county." There was murmuring among the crowd, some supportive, some skeptical. An older woman named Martha Simmons stood up. "That all sounds good in theory, but my husband tried to hold out and they burned our barn. We lost everything and had to sell. How do we know the same won't happen to us?" "We don't," Hayes said honestly. "But I know that if we give in to fear, we've already lost. This land is ours, bought and paid for legally. We have a right to work it and live on it without being terrorized. If we stand together, we have a chance. If we don't, we have none." Slowly, one by one, the ranchers began to agree. They formed a watch schedule, with men taking turns patrolling the properties of those who were most vulnerable. They agreed to document everything and to support each other in whatever way necessary. As they left the meeting, Sarah slipped her hand into Hayes's. "That was brave," she said. "What you did in there, getting everyone to work together." "I just hope it's enough," Hayes said, squeezing her hand. "I keep thinking about what could happen if things turn violent. The Jamesons have men who are handy with guns, and most of us are just farmers and ranchers." "Don't think like that," Sarah said firmly. "You're doing the right thing, and right has to count for something." But that night, lying in her bed, Sarah couldn't shake her own fears. She had found happiness here, found love, and the thought of losing it was unbearable. She slipped out of bed and padded to Hayes's door, knocking softly when he opened it. Wearing only his trousers and an unbuttoned shirt, Sarah felt her breath catch. "I can't sleep," she said. "I keep worrying about what might happen." Hayes stepped back, letting her into his room. They sat on his bed, not touching at first, just being close to each other in the darkness. "I'm scared too," Hayes admitted. "Not so much for myself, but for you. For what might happen to you if things go wrong." "I'm not leaving," Sarah said firmly. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Hayes turned to her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" he murmured. "I ask myself the same thing," Sarah whispered. They kissed again, and this time there was an urgency to it, a need driven by fear and love and the knowledge that their time together might be more fragile than they wanted to believe. Hayes pulled back, his breathing ragged. "Sarah, we should stop. I don't want to compromise you." "You're not compromising me," Sarah said. "I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you." "Then marry me," Hayes said suddenly. "I know it's fast. I know we've only admitted our feelings for a short time, but Sarah, I want you to be my wife. I want to make this official, make sure you're protected no matter what happens. Marry me." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." They held each other in the darkness, and Sarah felt a peace settle over her despite all the uncertainty surrounding them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church in Concordia. Mrs. Patterson stood up as Sarah's witness, and a rancher named Bill Coleman stood for Hayes. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Hayes kissed Sarah with such love that several of the women in attendance wiped away tears. They spent their wedding night at the ranch, and Sarah moved her few belongings from her small room into Hayes's larger one. That night, in the safety of her husband's arms, Sarah felt a completeness she had never known before. She was home, truly home, in a way she had never been anywhere else. But their happiness was shadowed by the ongoing trouble with the Jamesons. 2 weeks after the wedding, the tensions came to a head. Hayes was out with Bill Coleman and Amos Henderson, riding the property lines of their adjoining ranches, when they spotted smoke rising from the direction of Hayes's ranch. Hayes felt his heart stop. Sarah was home alone, had insisted she would be fine for the few hours he was gone. He kicked his horse into a gallop, racing back toward the ranch with Bill and Amos close behind. His mind was filled with terrible images, memories of what had happened to the Simmons barn, fears of what he might find when he got home. He burst into the yard and felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked him from his horse. The house was untouched, but the barn was ablaze. Sarah was in the yard, pumping water frantically and throwing buckets on the flames. Several of the horses were loose in the corral, and Sarah had clearly managed to get them out before the fire spread. Hayes leapt from his horse and ran to help, with Bill and Amos joining in. They fought the fire for over an hour before finally getting it under control. The barn was badly damaged but not completely destroyed, and all the animals had been saved. Sarah collapsed on the ground, her face streaked with soot, her dress singed in places. Hayes knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, running his hands over her, checking for injuries. "I'm fine," she gasped. "Hayes, I saw them. I saw the Jamesons' men. They rode up while you were gone, threw torches into the barn, and rode off laughing. I tried to stop them, but there were 3 of them, and I couldn't." "You did perfectly," Hayes said fiercely, holding her tight. "You saved the horses, and you're safe. That's all that matters." But it wasn't all that mattered, not really. The attack had been brazen, done in broad daylight with a witness. It was a direct challenge, and Hayes knew they couldn't let it stand. That evening, with Sarah's burns bandaged and the remains of the barn still smoldering, Hayes called another meeting of the ranchers. This time, the mood was different. The attack on Hayes's property, with his wife present, had crossed a line that even the most cautious ranchers couldn't ignore. "We need to go to the territorial marshal," Hayes said. "The sheriff won't help us, but if we go over his head, bring in outside law enforcement, the Jamesons won't be able to intimidate them the way they have the local authorities. The nearest marshal is 3 days' ride from here," Bill Coleman pointed out. "And even if we get him to come back with us, what proof do we have? It's our word against the Jamesons." "Sarah saw their men," Hayes said. "She can identify them." Mrs. Patterson stood up, her face grim. "I can identify the men who burned my barn, too. I didn't speak up before because I was scared, but I'm tired of living in fear. I'll testify to what I saw." One by one, other ranchers came forward with stories of harassment, threats, and property damage. It seemed everyone had been targeted in some way, but fear had kept them silent. Now, galvanized by the attack on Hayes and Sarah, they were ready to fight back. Hayes volunteered to make the 3-day ride to fetch the marshal, but Sarah refused to let him go alone. "If you're going, I'm going with you," she said firmly. "I'm not staying here while you ride into potential danger." "It's a hard ride," Hayes warned, "and it means leaving the ranch unprotected." "Bill and Amos can watch the ranch," Sarah said, "and I'm a good rider. I won't slow you down." Hayes looked at his wife, seeing the determination in her eyes, and knew better than to argue. They set out at dawn the next morning, riding east toward Kansas City, where the territorial marshal had his office. The journey was indeed hard, with long hours in the saddle and nights spent camping under the stars. But despite the difficulty, Sarah found herself cherishing the time alone with Hayes. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their childhoods, dreaming about the future they wanted to build together. On the second night, as they sat by their campfire, Hayes pulled Sarah into his arms. "When this is all over," he said, "I want to rebuild that barn bigger and better than before. I want to expand the herd, maybe add some more rooms to the house." "Rooms for what?" Sarah asked, though she had a good idea of what he was thinking. "For children," Hayes said, his hand coming to rest gently on her stomach. "I want to fill that house with children, Sarah. I want to build a life with you that's big and full and happy." "I want that too," Sarah said, tears pricking her eyes. "More than anything." They made love under the stars that night, and Sarah thought she had never felt closer to another person, never felt more certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be. They reached Kansas City on the afternoon of the 3rd day and found the marshal's office near the center of town. Marshal Robert Crane was a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He listened to their story without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "I've heard rumors about the Jamesons," he said when they finished. "But without proof or someone willing to testify, my hands were tied. If you've got witnesses willing to go on record, that changes things." "We have several people ready to testify," Hayes said, "and my wife witnessed the barn burning herself." Marshal Crane looked at Sarah. "Madam," You understand what you're agreeing to. Testifying against men like the Jamesons can be dangerous. I understand, Sarah said steadily, but someone has to stop them. They can't be allowed to terrorize people just because they want more land. The marshal nodded approvingly. All right then. I'll ride back with you and conduct a proper investigation. If the evidence supports what you're telling me, I'll arrest the Jamesons and any of their men involved in these crimes. They started back the next morning, with Marshal Crane and 2 of his deputies accompanying them. The return journey felt faster, fueled by hope that finally something would be done about the Jamesons' reign of terror. When they arrived back in Concordia, Hayes was relieved to find the ranch intact. Bill and Amos had kept watch as promised, and there had been no further incidents. Marshal Crane set up a temporary office in the sheriff's office, much to Sheriff Mason's obvious displeasure, and began taking statements from the ranchers. The evidence was overwhelming. Nearly every small rancher in the area had a story of harassment or property damage. Mrs. Patterson identified 2 of the Jamesons' ranch hands as the men who had burned her barn. Sarah gave a detailed description of the 3 men who had set fire to Hayes's barn, and 2 other witnesses came forward to say they had seen those same men riding away from Hayes's property that day. Marshal Crane arrested the Jameson brothers and 4 of their ranch hands on charges of arson, property destruction, and criminal intimidation. The trials were set for the following month in Kansas City, where the Jamesons' influence wouldn't protect them. The arrest sent shockwaves through Concordia. Some townspeople, particularly those who had business dealings with the Jamesons, were angry and frightened about the economic impact. But most, especially the small ranchers and farmers, were relieved and grateful. On the night after the arrests, Hayes and Sarah sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. Hayes had his arm around Sarah, and she leaned against him, feeling a peace she hadn't known since the troubles began. "You think it's really over?" she asked. "I think so," Hayes said. "Without the Jamesons directing things, their men will probably scatter. And even if some of them cause trouble, the marshal made it clear he'll be keeping an eye on this area now." "I can hardly believe it," Sarah said. "A few months ago, I was sleeping under a porch with no hope and no future. Now I'm married to the man I love with a home and a real chance at happiness." Hayes tightened his arm around her. "You gave me hope too," he said. "This ranch was just a place I lived before you came. You made it a home." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, then Sarah said, "Hayes, I need to tell you something." He looked at her, concerned by her serious tone. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," Sarah said, watching his face carefully. "I'm almost certain. I was going to wait to be sure, but I thought you should know." For a moment, Hayes just stared at her, and Sarah felt a flutter of worry. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen. He stood up, pulling her to her feet, and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "We're going to have a baby," he said, setting her down gently and cupping her face in his hands. "Really, really," Sarah said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Are you happy?" "Happy," Hayes kissed her deeply. "Sarah, I'm the happiest man alive." The winter passed quietly, with Sarah's pregnancy progressing smoothly and the ranch recovering from the damage of the previous months. The trials in Kansas City resulted in convictions for both Jameson brothers and their ranch hands. The Jamesons lost their ranch in restitution payments to their victims, and the property was divided among several buyers, including some of the small ranchers they had terrorized. Hayes threw himself into rebuilding the barn and preparing for the arrival of their child. He built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it smooth and carving delicate patterns into the sides. Sarah sewed blankets and tiny clothes, often with Mrs. Patterson's help and advice. In early April of 1877, after a long night of labor with Mrs. Patterson attending as midwife, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Jacob Thomas Northwood, after Sarah's brother and Hayes's mentor, combining the names of the two men who had shaped their lives. Hayes held his son with wonder in his eyes, his large hands cradling the tiny infant with infinite gentleness. "He's perfect," he whispered. "You're perfect. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for giving me this family." Sarah, exhausted but glowing with happiness, watched her husband with their son and felt her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I love you," she said. "I love you both so much." The first years of Jacob's life were marked by growth and prosperity. The ranch flourished, with Hayes's careful management and Sarah's tireless work. They added more cattle, improved the property, and built the extra rooms Hayes had dreamed of. Their second child, a daughter they named Grace Margaret, arrived 2 years after Jacob. Then came Henry, then Alice, until the Northwood house was indeed full of the children Hayes had wished for, their laughter ringing through the rooms and across the prairie. Mrs. Patterson became a beloved grandmother figure to the children, teaching them to gather eggs and telling them stories of the old days. The community of small ranchers remained tight-knit, bound together by the trials they had faced and overcome. On a warm summer evening in 1885, Sarah and Hayes sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. Jacob, now 8, was teaching 6-year-old Grace to rope a fence post, while 4-year-old Henry tried to imitate them, and 2-year-old Alice tottered around, getting in everyone's way. "Do you ever think about that morning I found you under the general store porch?" Hayes asked, taking Sarah's hand in his. "Sometimes," Sarah said. "It feels like a different life, like it happened to a different person. I was so lost then, so hopeless. I knew from the moment I saw you that my life was about to change," Hayes said. "I just didn't know how much or how wonderful that change would be." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. "You saved me," she said, "not just by offering me a room, but by seeing me as a person worth saving." "You saved me right back," Hayes said. "I was so lonely before you came, living but not really alive. You brought color and warmth and meaning to everything." They sat together, hands entwined, watching their children and the sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The ranch spread out around them, a testament to their hard work and determination. The vegetable garden flourished, the barn stood strong and new, the cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. Jacob ran up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. "Papa, can we have a campfire tonight?" "Please, I want to show Grace how you taught me to find the North Star." Hayes smiled at his son. "I think that's a fine idea. Go gather some wood and make sure you get Henry to help you." As Jacob ran off, calling for his brother, Sarah said, "You're a wonderful father." "I had a good teacher," Hayes said. "Tom used to say that the measure of a man's life isn't what he acquires but what he builds. Not just buildings and ranches, but relationships and family and community. I think about that a lot." "He would be proud of you," Sarah said. "And my brother Jacob too. They both would be proud of what we've built here." That night, the whole family gathered around the campfire. Hayes pointed out constellations while Sarah told stories. The children roasted apples on sticks and asked endless questions about everything from the stars to the cattle to how their parents had met. "Tell us again about how you met Mama," Grace begged, snuggling against Sarah's side. Hayes smiled at Sarah over the children's heads. "Well, it was a summer morning much like this one, and I was heading into town for supplies. I happened to look under the general store porch, and there was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, all covered in dust, but with eyes that held strength and courage." "You thought Mama was beautiful even though she was dirty?" Jacob asked skeptically. "Especially then," Hayes said, because I could see she hadn't given up, even though things were hard. That kind of strength is the most beautiful thing in the world." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to her husband tell their story. The children eventually drifted off to sleep, one by one, and Hayes carried them to bed while Sarah banked the fire. Later, lying in their bed with Hayes's arm around her, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here. From desperation and despair to love and family, from sleeping under a porch to owning a home filled with warmth and laughter. It hadn't been easy. They had faced poverty, threats, violence, and countless challenges, but they had faced them together, and that had made all the difference. "Hayes," she said softly into the darkness. Thank you for offering your spare room to a stranger sleeping under a porch." Hayes chuckled and pulled her closer. "Best decision I ever made, though I have to say that spare room didn't stay spare for very long." "No regrets?" Sarah asked, though she knew the answer. "Not a single one," Hayes said firmly. "Every day with you has been a gift. Every challenge we've faced has been worth it because we faced it together. I love you, Sarah Northwood." "I love you too," Sarah whispered. As the years continued to pass, the Northwood Ranch became known throughout the region as a place of hospitality and kindness. Hayes and Sarah never forgot what it felt like to be desperate and alone, so their door was always open to those in need. They hired drifters down on their luck, gave food to traveling families, and became known for their generous spirit. Their children grew strong and healthy, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Jacob showed a talent for horse training, spending hours in the corrals working with the animals with the same patience and skill his father had shown. Grace inherited her mother's practical nature and her father's stubbornness, declaring at age 10 that she intended to run her own ranch someday. Henry was quieter, with a love for books that surprised both parents, and Alice was pure sunshine, making friends with everyone she met. In 1890, the Northwood family expanded again with the birth of twin boys, Samuel and Daniel. Sarah, now 36, recovered more slowly from this pregnancy, and Hayes hovered over her with anxious care until she shooed him away, insisting she was fine. "I'm not made of glass," she protested when he tried to forbid her from working in the garden. "I've had 6 children now, Hayes. I think I know my own limits." 7 children, Hayes corrected, gathering her into his arms despite her protests. 6 children and one overprotective husband who loves you more than anything in this world and wants to make sure you're around for a long, long time. Sarah softened, wrapping her arms around him. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. "We've got too much life left to live together." The children adored their baby brothers, with even Jacob, now a lanky 13-year-old who pretended to be too grown up for such things, sneaking into the nursery to make faces at the twins and smile when they giggled at him. As the century drew to a close, the wild frontier that Sarah and Hayes had known in their youth began to change. Towns grew larger, railroads connected distant communities, and the lawlessness of the early years gave way to more structured civilization. Concordia grew from a dusty frontier town into a proper small city, with schools, churches, and businesses lining streets that were now maintained and patrolled by a competent police force. But through all the changes, the Northwood Ranch remained a constant, a piece of the old frontier preserved and cherished. Hayes taught his sons everything Tom Crawford had taught him about ranching, while Sarah taught her daughters not just housekeeping, but also strength, independence, and the importance of standing up for what was right. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Hayes took Sarah on a trip back to Pennsylvania, leaving the ranch in Jacob's capable hands. They visited the farm where Sarah had grown up, now owned by another family, and stood at the graves of her parents and the brother she had come west to find. "I wish they could have known you," Sarah said, holding Hayes's hand as they stood in the small cemetery. "Wish they could have seen what became of my life." "I think they know," Hayes said gently. "And I think they're proud of the woman you became, the family you've raised." They traveled to Ohio too, so Hayes could show Sarah where he had grown up. The house was long gone, sold to pay his father's debts, but they walked the land where he had spent his childhood, and Sarah saw the shadows of pain in his eyes fade a little as he told her stories of his mother and the few good memories he had from that time. "We've both come so far," Sarah said as they boarded the train to return home. "Sometimes it hardly seems real." "It's real," Hayes assured her, kissing her temple. "Every beautiful, difficult, wonderful moment of it." They returned to find the ranch thriving under Jacob's temporary management, and their children full of stories about everything that had happened while they were gone. That night, lying in their own bed after weeks away, Sarah felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Hayes asked, concerned by her tears. "I'm just happy," Sarah said. "So incredibly, impossibly happy. Sometimes I can't believe this is my life." Hayes pulled her close, and they lay together in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of home. The soft breathing of children in nearby rooms, the rustle of wind through the prairie grass, the distant lowing of cattle. It was the music of the life they had built together, and it was more beautiful than any symphony. As the new century dawned in 1900, the Northwood children began to spread their wings. Jacob, now 23, married the daughter of a neighboring rancher and started his own small spread with land his parents helped him purchase. Grace, true to her childhood declaration, partnered with a female rancher from Kansas to start a horse breeding operation that quickly became profitable. Henry headed east to college, determined to become a teacher. Alice, now 18 and beautiful, was being courted by half the young men in the county, much to Hayes's consternation. "They're all wrong for her," he grumbled one evening, watching yet another suitor ride up to the house. Sarah laughed, remembering how her father had said the exact same thing about her suitors years ago. "You have to let her choose, just like someone let me choose you." "That was different," Hayes protested. "I was worthy of you." "Were you?" Sarah teased. A drifting cowboy who offered a strange woman his spare room, Hayes grinned and pulled her into his arms. "That drifting cowboy turned out all right, I think." "Better than all right," Sarah agreed, kissing him. Even after all these years, his kiss still made her heart race. The twins, now 10, were wild and adventurous, constantly getting into mischief and keeping their parents on their toes. But they were good boys at heart, loyal and loving, and Sarah cherished every moment with them, knowing from experience how quickly children grew and changed. In 1905, tragedy struck when Mrs. Patterson passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78. Her death hit the Northwood family hard, as she had been a constant presence in their lives for nearly 30 years. They buried her on her own land, as she had requested, and the funeral was attended by nearly everyone in the county. "She was the first person to vouch for us," Sarah said at the graveside, her voice thick with tears. "When we barely knew each other, when people might have judged our arrangement harshly, she stood up for us. She was family." Hayes squeezed her hand, his own eyes wet. "She told me once that she saw in us what she and her husband had, real love, the kind that lasts. She said it gave her hope that such things still existed in the world." After the funeral, the family gathered at the ranch, sharing memories of Mrs. Patterson and finding comfort in each other's presence. It was a reminder that life was precious and finite, that the moments of love and connection were what mattered most. The years continued to roll by, bringing both joys and sorrows. Alice married a young doctor and moved to Kansas City, though she visited often. The twins grew into strong young men who worked the ranch alongside their father. More grandchildren arrived, filling the ranch with laughter and chaos during holidays and visits. Hayes's hair turned silver at the temples, then white, but his eyes remained as bright and his love for Sarah as strong as ever. Sarah developed arthritis that made her hands ache, but she continued to work her garden and cook the meals that brought her family together. They faced each challenge as they had always faced them, together. On a spring evening in 1916, exactly 40 years after that morning when Hayes had found Sarah under the general store porch, they sat together on the porch of the ranch house. They were both in their 60s now, their children grown and scattered, though most still lived close enough to visit regularly. The ranch was now run primarily by the twins, with Hayes overseeing things but letting his sons do most of the hard physical labor. 40 years, Sarah said, her hand in Hayes's, both their fingers gnarled with age but their grip still strong. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like just yesterday. You remember how scared you were that first day? Hayes asked. You looked like a wild thing, ready to bolt at any moment. I remember thinking you were either a saint or a madman to offer help to someone like me, Sarah said with a smile. Turns out you were a little bit of both. Hayes laughed, the sound rich and warm. I remember thinking I was going to fall in love with you and being terrified by the thought. Figured I'd spend the whole time you were here fighting my feelings and trying to be a gentleman. How long did that last? Sarah teased. About a month, Hayes admitted. Then I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. Best decision you ever made, Sarah said. Second best, Hayes corrected. The best was offering you that spare room in the first place. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the land they had worked and loved for 4 decades. The ranch had seen them through poverty and prosperity, danger and peace, sorrow and joy. It had been the foundation of their family, the physical manifestation of the life they had built together. Hayes, Sarah said softly, if you could go back and do it all over again, would you change anything? Hayes thought about it seriously, as he always did when Sarah asked important questions. Not a thing, he said finally. Every struggle brought us to where we are now. Every challenge made us stronger. Every joy was sweeter because of what we'd overcome. No, I wouldn't change a single moment. Not even the time the twins accidentally let all the chickens loose, and we spent 3 days trying to catch them. Sarah asked with a smile. Hayes chuckled. Not even that, though I might have tied those boys' shoelaces together before I let them near the chicken coop. They laughed together, the sound carrying across the prairie in the evening air. Inside the house, they could hear the twins arguing good-naturedly about something, their voices deep and male now but still with the echoes of the boys they had been. We did good, didn't we? Sarah asked. With the children, with the ranch, with our life. We did more than good, Hayes said firmly. We built something real and lasting. We raised children who are strong and kind and capable. We created a home that's been a refuge for dozens of people over the years. We loved each other well. What more could anyone ask for? As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, Hayes helped Sarah to her feet, and they walked slowly into the house together. The ranch would continue on after them, passed down to their children and grandchildren, a legacy of love and hard work and determination. But that night, wrapped in each other's arms in the bed they had shared for 4 decades, Hayes and Sarah were simply 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a life more beautiful than either could have imagined. I love you, Sarah whispered into the darkness. I love you too, Hayes responded, his arms tightening around her. Always have, always will. And in that moment, with the prairie wind whistling softly outside and the sounds of home all around them, everything was perfect. A lonely cowboy had offered his spare room to a desperate woman sleeping under a porch, and from that simple act of kindness had grown a love story that would echo through generations, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and the enduring strength of two hearts beating as one.